Hello.
Good to go.
Awesome. All right. Welcome all to the ESL semi-finals and congratulations for breaking this far. We've already done our introduction, so I'd like to welcome the first speaker of the affirmative team to get this debate started. Whenever you're ready.
Hello, am I visible and audible?
You're visible and audible.
All right, just give me a second. Okay, no preferred gender pronouns. Three, two, one. Panel, when we're talking about housing, it's important that the actor that manages, operates, and owns this particular housing is one that is reliable, is one that we can hold accountable, and is the one privileged with the most amount of resources, therefore maximizing our access, maximizing our reach in terms of how many people that we're actually helping when we do this particular policy or when we pass this particular motion. Two things that I'm going to be doing in my speech, two pieces to our framing, ultimately to two arguments, firstly on the principle, secondly on pragmatics. On our framing, that firstly, I think it's important to understand the distinction between public housing and community housing. In short, what it is public housing are housing projects by the government that are built for the purpose of housing people who are underprivileged and can't afford housing in the first place. Community housing, on the other hand, targets the same group of people, like in terms of benefit, but the difference is these projects are subsidized by different actors like NGOs and corporations and are predominantly owned by private corporations in both worlds, right? What do we then support? Number one, we'll provide reasons to why social housing should rightfully only be managed by the state in terms of ownership and distribution, and why the pragmatics of our side outweigh any harm that will be posited by the side of negative. The basic model in our world looks like in modern liberal democracies. I don't think we're necessarily talking about corrupted actors or governments who are incapable, because even within instances, even within contexts in which governments are capable, organizations, I would posit to you, are even less incapable of providing housing in those contexts. Therefore, in our world, we'll disallow any actors who subsidize housing projects on their own accord, whilst only allowing those by the state. Onto our principle then, firstly on the ownership and management of a public good. The importance here is to understand that public goods are necessities provided by the government for the people, like food, housing, and in certain contexts, healthcare and education as well. The rationale behind this provision of this good is that governments are directly responsible to provide goods that are necessary in order to preserve people's life and to preserve the sanctity of the livelihood of people. The reason why this principle can only exist exclusively on the side of government is for three reasons. Number one is for uniformity in implementation, which means even if you have both actors participating in this particular policy, you will not be able to provide the full scale of benefit intended. We will prove to you why later in pragmatics. But secondly, a lot of times people in your world will be constrained into making a decision, which means people are likely to opt into one form of housing in the first place. But when another form of housing comes up by another corporation, for example, you opted into social housing, but now this other form of housing by this corporation comes out, the fact that you already opted into this decision in the first place means you lose out on another benefit. I think people are just constrained into making a decision in your part. You force them to choose between two particular actors who will be handling this particular housing. But third reason then is to contribute to complacency, because it's easier for governments in the side of negative to deflect accountability due to collusion, due to assumptions that private developers already own the area, therefore the government does not have to help the urban poor. Two benefits then of the state directly overseeing this project. Number one is in terms of access, because it's an inherent incentive on the part of the state that pertains to welfare and the maximization of access to this particular welfare, which is why states can't just get away with giving welfare to a specific group of people within a specific demographic. If it's given, it has to be given on the basis of income bracket and on the basis of need. I would argue that governments are more capable of providing in accordance to need. But secondly, in the incentive to win votes, and the metric here is accountability, it means that if this housing project sucks, there is an actual recourse available for individuals in terms of accountability, where you can call out your public representatives, or you can even vote them out in the next election if they're not doing a good job in terms of this particular housing. I've proven why it's much better. But secondly, in terms of sustainable pool of resources, because I think firstly, this is data, which means you have more holistic or comprehensive information in relation to like income bracket data or like specific areas and demographics that are affected even more by a lack of housing or lack of reliable housing projects. And this data is also more likely to be updated because things like unemployment happen very quickly, right? I don't think you can co-opt this on opposition because you cannot necessarily claim or fiat that all this form of information will be shared with private corporations, organizations, and other developers as well, especially when even governments assume this information to be one that is sensitive. And I don't think people will be comfortable with sharing a lot of this private information with things like organizations. People are more acceptable to governments having this form of information because that's just the way things have been. But secondly, in terms of money and funds, I think governments are more likely to have a sustainable pool of funds because number one is because there's a fixed allocation of budget that is like happens or takes place annually, where government sets this is the set amount of budget that we can have annually in order to help housing or in order to contribute to a housing project. But also secondly, you have more MPs that are in check, that are elected to oversee this particular budget, which means you have more people who can call for higher budgets within housing projects. You can have people who lobby for higher funds within housing projects. I think that's much more preferable. But in terms of private actors, what are their incentives and why are they not in line with what is needed for housing projects? Number one is in profit incentive. In terms of ownership of these projects, not only does this suck because now your private corporations will probably trade off benefit for the people, but also because these policies are unlikely to be sustainable, right? Because in the world of affirmative, the way in which it works is that private corporations, even when subsidizing the particular cost for this particular condominium or particular high-rise building, whatever housing building they want to talk about, they are unlikely to be sustainable because of how they will reduce costs they will increase costs for other inhabitants, which means they pay more. But in the long term, you're unable to provide for people more. But secondly, in terms of prioritization of comfort for the richest, which means in any housing project that's handled or developed by a private corporation, the comfort will always be for the richest groups of people. I know Rashrvin will come out here and try and argue to you why there are different kinds of housing projects that cater to different kind of people, but the core fundamental idea here is the same, that in all these instances, the incentive is to prioritize profit. But secondly, then it's an actor that you're unable to hold accountable. There are no accountability mechanisms whatsoever that you have on the side of negative. The most you have on your side is probably like call out these corporations or whatever, but even that is only to a minimal extent, especially when they are providing housing in this particular instance, because then they can just say, but we're doing like a social good for you. How can you not be appreciative? I think you force people to make decisions that they're probably not comfortable with making, and we'll prove to you why. The conclusion to this principle is simple. We prove why this principle can only exclusively exist in the side of affirmative, in terms of accountability and in terms of a wider pool of resources, in terms of data and in terms of funds. I think it's much more important that the government exclusively holds this right in the side of affirmative. On to our second argument then on how subsidies will hurt people in the interim and the long term. The first thing here is to note that we can group NGOs and community groups separately and companies separately. Let's then look at community groups and NGOs because we can assume that they are probably the most well-intentioned people who generally want to help. And this is the best case of negative, right? Number one, here's an ambiguous chain of resources. A lot of enterprises as such are very low in resources because they are based off of donations and like small scale projects that are oftentimes run by them. But they're also smaller in number in terms of size, which means that the reach of this organization is one that is small because they don't have probably many people working within this particular organization or volunteering within this particular organization in order to maximize the reach of this particular housing project. But with this small amount of resources, then they have to balance out interests of helping poor people in other areas versus helping people in areas that they're probably more proximate to, which means now the conclusion to this particular part is that there's many responsibilities with little to no cash. The impact here is then simple, is that the number one is that the subsidy amount will constantly change, which means the access or like the benefit of access to people will change every time that there's a housing project taking place. It's not a benefit that's consistent. But secondly, even if there is subsidy, I think the maintenance costs will just fuck over poor people in the interim period, because I don't know if you can fiat that they're going to subsidize literally everything or pay for literally everything. We can fiat that because the government literally owns this particular project in our side. The reason why this is important is because high-rise density buildings, where so many things fuck up, like the water supply or electricity supply and things like that, I think it's important that we maintain a degree of sustainability. The reason why this hurts in the long term is because our side, government has an incentive to ensure positive externalities, which means housing won't just be about homing these people, but it will be in areas that are coming up, which means once the government builds a housing project here, they can build hospitals, they can build roads and things like that, which means our long-term potential on our side is just much better. The comparative is simple, Judge. Social mixing is much better when the government can build houses in these poor areas, because number one, I think it's more likely to be sustainable in terms of other projects that we can incorporate into particularly building this housing project in terms of maximizing employment, but also in terms of a principle why this is much better actor and it's much more reliable reliable. I would argue that that's much preferable when we talk about a public good as important as housing. So proud.
Right, thank you very much for that speech. I'm now to call on the first speaker of the negative team to open their case.
Hi, am I visible and audible? All right, thank you, panel. He, him pronouns. Give me 10 seconds to set up. Okay, panel, beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, when you read the motion, right, notice that it states that states should only use public housing when conducting social housing policies. Meaning to say, side affirmative should have pushed the burden on why the exclusive dependency on public housing, on the state being the only actor to control it, is actually the exclusive. What did Ahsan come into use today? He is talking as if our model is that we only defend corporations and that we ignore community groups as a whole, and that the people don't have liability towards these corporations, and that somehow on our side the government doesn't have control over these corporations. But in reality, we're going to paint to you our model why we win to this debate. Three parts of my speech for today: responses, my counter framing, then moving on to the substantive, and just a slight comparative to tell you where we win over affirmative, right? Panel responses 3 as a whole. Firstly, they say that corporations own these projects. We say that is status quo. There is no country where the corporations own the projects, people own it. Because if they do, people won't like it because they're basically giving away their houses to corporations that then have lesser accountability. Also, you perceive it as such in Ahsan's world. Therefore, the states would then lose out in a landslide in elections because people don't like that, obviously, right? People want to live in houses that they own, or at least to some extent owned by someone that they can be held accountable by a social contract, right, panel? Because you all know financial concerns are not as reliable because you need somewhat over dependency on a communal level. Secondly, they say that, they want to maximize access. 3 responses to this. Firstly, we say that the state has a lot of bureaucratic hurdles. I'll explain to you later in my substantive. Secondly, we say that the states have other problems to cater to, like healthcare, job security, etc., whereas the state should actually focus more on those problems rather than just focusing solely on housing. We tell you why the state is able to do both of these on our side. Third response is that information on tenants is the inherent contract that corporations have with their customers. It is transactional. It being transactional, therefore, we have laws to hold them accountable, and it is completely better on our side because corporations will have to listen to the government more because they are their direct creditor. Because if they do not listen, they won't get their pay. On their side, on side affirmative, you cannot hold the government because you cannot hold the government accountable on the same scale. Because in what world where you sue your government and you succeed? This is a burden side affirmative has to prove to you to win on the principle of accountability. Final response that we are not defending a world where only corporations are the one in charge. Rather, we are defending a world where the corporations and community groups are building these houses with the oversight of the government. That is our model for today. Ahsan is talking as if our model is that we only defend corporations without the oversight of the government. They don't even include community groups in the first place, and also ignore the fact that government still has control over these corporations. On our side, no weighing in to say on which scale wins, therefore we win on that clash itself, right, panel? And then the sub-counter framing decarbonization, right? We say that social housing policies look like the inherent need to provide people with more houses. The organizations then look like 3 non-government organizations like Prima in Malaysia, companies like Symphony that are in charge of housing projects like Tijani and Perdana, community groups where people combine together to fund their houses. The models that we outsource building to these corporations with government oversight, government still have costs but comparatively less. To affirmative, government is the best creditor because A, they have large users, and B, they already have the land. There's no need for you to fight for land in our world. The burden is set to prove to you why government is the only actor in why government only as an actor in public housing is bad. We need other actors as well, and why the exclusive benefit of other actors like corporations and housing organizations exists on our side. Affirmative has to prove to you why only public housing is the best method in today's debate. Substantive then panel twofold. Firstly, on the account of sustainability, 3 prongs to this. On sustainability, first prong is in status quo, public housing is not optimal, it is bullshit. Because of the low cost, there's no return on investment for the government when using taxpayer money. People don't like that, right, panel? It is also unsustainable because governments are incentivized to fulfill the housing quota. Therefore, they use cheap and they use cheap material and fast building, therefore resulting in low maintenance because government is busy handling other policies. They want to finish the quota as fast as possible, right, panel? And in terms of them not being able to build high quality houses because the materials are expensive, the government is not incentivized to do so. Even if they are incentivized to do so, they will most probably build it in high cost areas where it's only available to the rich in the first place. it's trying to defeating the purpose of social housing policies to begin with. Now, second point to this is that the nature of people's tenancy, right? Why it's better on our side, more sustainable for the individual, because when the government builds, the residents do not own the houses, the government does. We're going to tell you why later. It's better for the individual to own the houses and why they do own the houses when corporations build them. Comparatively, that is the comparative on our side. Until how long would the residents say? Because Ahsan never told us under what tenancy duration or what under assurance do these people even get to stay in the government built houses, because at one point the government is gonna need to rotate through the residency. Ahsan never even touch on that, right, panel? Right, panel. Moving on to the third prong to this, why including corporations in building houses is good. Because corporations have three things. Firstly, experience, because they have been doing it, for a while, obviously because it's their, their job. Secondly, is that they have money, because they're corporations, they have their own separate funds. Comparative on their side is that government has to reach into tax reserve to ensure and maintain these public houses. Therefore, they take away from the funds for other policies. People won't like that, probably losing a landslide election to begin with, right, panel? And third thing that these corporations have, and community groups as a whole, is because the expertise, right? They have been doing this. This is what they specialize in. This is literally what they're supposed to do. People hold them accountable to that sense of competency. They have been doing this for a while. Comparatively, government on their side, when government is the only actor, they only have subpar expertise in this because they have other sections of policies to focus on. Even if somehow Kuhan comes to you and say that these governments can outsource these professionals to then build these houses to begin with, and obviously as an individual professional and a professional architect or a professional project manager, you'll be more incentivized to work with corporations because corporations are rich. Corporations will pay you directly because corporations have an incentive to keep you as a specialist comparative to their competitors, right? Whereas government only has to keep you under benefits, right? They say that, if you work with us, we have less tax, you have more tax cuts, we even though we give you less pay, you have like special benefits that come from you. We see as an individual professional architect, we most likely stay in corporations because the corporations are much more flashy, corporations give us more money, we have more financial security under working with corporations. Why are then corporations are interested to even be in our model to begin with? Because they don't have to fight for land because government will give them the land in the first place in these housing policies, and secondly, because the government will become the debtors because they are the most reliable debtors on the market. Government will never default on their payment, and thus resulting in more fiscal security for the corporations, getting faster payments out of the government, therefore them being more incentivized to build in more faster, build in more by bulk. What is then the assurance that these corporations will not be malicious? Because the government can handle them, can hold them accountable, they can blacklist them, and even if insofar as the corporations refuse to listen to them, government can strip their licenses panel. Corporations will listen because it risks their lifespan, it risks their revenue in the first place. B, the corporation will lose on their tenders because they will lose on profit. Their competitors will gain more because if insofar as Tijani decides to be malicious and give and hike up the prices on the housing, they will lose out on the tenders on the next building projects, therefore giving it to the other competitors. Therefore, that competitor having more money, there's the inherent incentive for them to be malevolent. What is then the second substantive palatability of the community? One fold only, the community itself. First prong, we want the community to build the community because they are the most incentivized actors. They are the ones that end up living there. They know what they want. They know what they have. Second prong is that it's better for the individual because they are involved in the building of houses in the first place. They have more stake in ownership. They have incentive for greater maintenance of the house. Therefore, they also have incentive to hire professionals to then build the houses themselves. The final prong, final argument, final incentive is that it is faster to start on our world because in their world, only the government can determine when to start a build-up. It's bad because they have a lot of bureaucratic hurdles to go through because they use taxpayer money. They have to ensure due diligence. Resulting then they will take too long. People cannot wait. In a affirmative model, they will wait too long. Therefore, comparatively on our side, that is not the case. Corporations don't have these bureaucratic hurdles to go through. They can start straight away. The build won't be instant, but it will be much more faster comparatively by margins on our side. The people can get their houses sooner by months or even years, best case scenario. We can also build public housing simultaneously because then it amplifies the benefits on the side affirmative. Therefore, we win on their own clash, and we argue to that their exclusive reliability on states is the harm, not the model itself. We cop that out. Vote for side negative. Thank you, panel.
Right, thank you very much for that speech. I now to call on the second speaker of the affirmative team to continue this debate.
Am I visible and audible? Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Poverty is a disease that is plaguing the most vulnerable. Oftentimes, the lack of having access towards housing doesn't only mean that you do not have a home to be comfortable and protected in, but it also means you largely lose out on your financial ability or purchasing power to purchase everyday goods and services that make you sustain this life, which is why it is pertinent for us to characterize something as public as housing, which is a public good that's so important for individual sustainability, has to be one that's managed by the government, that has an incentive, perverse incentive that pertains towards citizens' life and welfare, and is likely to make it sustainable in a way that comprehensively develops poor people, not just by having a home, but also able to access other form of amenities that is crucial for sustainability. 2 questions I'm going to answer in this speech. Firstly, why must the state be the sole actor that is responsible of owning and distributing housing? And secondly, how will subsidies under the world of negative hurt individuals and the most vulnerable? I'll explain why poor people are significantly lacked out or lost out under this world and why the comparative weighing on the outside is better. Before that, just one technical thing to point out. Negative team pushes the burden on us to explain why our model doesn't encompass tendency or how long this duration looks like. First thing to note is that this debate is a value judgment debate. We don't require a model to explain what this tendency look like, but rather the pertinent discussion in this debate as to whether or not public housing in of itself, whether its merits outweigh community housing in this particular juncture. I don't think that's something that is fair game in this debate for negative team to contend on. First question then, why must state be the sole actor that is responsible of owning and distributing housing? The first part to this is I want to explain the capacity to intervene. Negative team pushes the claim on our side to say that our side talks about this whole principle on government with absolutely no acknowledgement that in their side there's government intervention as well. This is why it's incredibly unnuanced. Our principle that came out from first speaker explained why this should be controlled specifically by government, and therefore this is something that's important because we avoid 3 harms. These 3 harms were completely not touched about by the negative team speaker. So we were in the side that explained why we didn't acknowledge that their side at governments, but we think the sharing responsibility of both governments and corporations on their side necessarily manifest into 3 harms. What are the harms? Number 1, the lack of uniformity in implementation doesn't provide the full scale of benefit intended. What does this look like? Oftentimes things like housing is for the purpose of creating access for individuals to create some level of, to get into a home and to get into a better form of amenities and living conditions. If it is shared by private entities and both the governments, oftentimes we can't accommodate the full scale of accessibility of benefits or sustainability of benefits, because on one side, maybe you're providing more access towards poor people, but more private developing and by community ways is something you don't get the full scale of this benefit. That's a significant harm. When it's shared responsibility, they have to be more nuanced. Number 2, we necessarily put individuals in ability to make decision, often through their geographically constrained, due to, for example, poor people being a specific demographic, or there's a housing project that happens on their side. The shifting in choices that offers for poor people oftentimes make them not able to choose what's best for them, and I'll argue that's more confusing and more detrimental to them. But finally, we explain why this can be a mechanism taken by governments to deflect accountability, because they can explain in a more developed area, it's probably the case that private developers already own the area, dominated area, have some level of housing there. That's probably an area in which we won't want to enter. So it engage in some level of a collusion. I would argue this affects greater accountability on the part of state to not pertain to its livelihood of citizens, because oftentimes you lose out on the population of things like urban poor, because you think urban poor are probably accommodated to by developers in private developings as well. These are 3 contentions that did not deal, this is something the negative team did not deal with. We were inside this only binary. Second claim to this argument is to explain how they can able to regulate payment by way of contracting. I think this is rubbish judge for them to make the claim that says now there's a transactional relationship by the government and all these developers and corporations, therefore they can hold them accountable. Number 1, this is subsidy. So how can it be by way of a legal contract? You're not paying these developers the full amount as well. It's just probably a subsidized amount. So at best, you're probably a paying customer. I don't understand the scale of difference in terms of the ability for you to control and have some level of accountability measures. So I'm unclear what their mechanism is. But number two, the status quo of a lot of private developers can bring you to court at a point in which you make any issue about how your house is so bad. They can bring you to court and explain why the subsidies something they already provided, why, and by way of a legal contract, they haven't done anything wrong. So I don't see what their solvency mechanism in terms of putting them accountable if you're going to be a paying customer that only pays some level of subsidies. But the third part of this claim is capacity to establish and their whole idea of mixed priorities. Their whole claim was that you have to tap into state resources, state has mixed priorities, therefore they can't do this. First response, this is an argument against governments doing anything. It's not nuanced to our claim to explain why governments oftentimes have an annual budget and the provision of budget is something that's already large enough to help towards poor people. This is important because even if we change to more corrupt governments or there's change of governments due elections, this vacuum is something we will not accommodate for because provision of budgets oftentimes fixed and happens annually towards the poor people. And we also explain why there's an incentive for MPs to always oversee it in parliament and fight for the poorest of the poor. They haven't dealt with how this is something that's fixed and long-term. But number two, oftentimes if the scope of this debate is we want to introduce public housing, that means there's more expenditure on the part of the government. More expenditure means it's translated to better management of public policy because there's a huge expenditure. It's probably a case where you have a precedence of a whole new budget for this. That means it's a whole new money and resources that are more sustainable on the part of government. But thirdly, what's the comparative judge? And this is where negative team largely lose out. Isn't it worse for NGOs and communities to hold based on two claims? Number one, on resources. We already make the statement to explain why NGOs and communities have significantly lesser resources because their pool of cash is contingent upon their donors as well. If they have a small amount of money, I'm unclear what is the change that they're able to introduce the debate because how can you subsidize to a large degree a lot of poor people out there who have a lot of homes? How can you subsidize the maintenance cost that goes about it? Number two, NGOs oftentimes have small number of people. That means there's lesser accountability on their parts. If anything goes wrong, you don't have a government that's able to keep in check and make any form of regulations. So even if they're right that governments don't have as much money, we think the comparative weighing is significantly worse out because NGOs are small, they don't have enough money, they're likely to be not sustainable. What's the weighing here, Judge? Even if it's true that corporations have the ability to expand land, we think we win on the qualifier on access and sustainability. If you're able to show to you in the second argument why poor people have a better life in terms of insulating themselves from a lot of harm and sustainably improve their lives comprehensively to making sure their lives are developed to a fullest extent, we take this debate. Second question then, how subsidies will hurt people in the interim and long-term period. We explain why there's an ambiguous pool of cash by NGOs because you don't know how much money they get. This is important because any externality that happens, i.e. your NGO doesn't do as well in terms of reputation and marketing due to the pandemic, this subsidy amount is likely to change. It can go lower and lower and lower and poor people have to pay more and more. Judge, even if you don't buy this, we also argue that subsidies don't accommodate for maintenance costs. If you live in condominiums, oftentimes the high cost of water and supply and utilities, oftentimes the chain of this utility supply, something is going to be affected because maintenance costs significantly high and poor people are significantly fucked over in those circumstances as well. Why do we win in the long term? At least in our ability, governments have an incentive to ensure there's positive externalities. They're likely to build public houses in areas that are poor, which means economies that grow around it are also in line with what the poor person can afford. It's not costs and goods or services that are so expensive in all these developed areas and urban areas where they can't afford it. But more importantly, there's better social mixing in our world. When governments build road to make sure richer people build some level of economic activity in these areas, there's some level of social mixing that is healthier. As opposed to in the world of negative, where middle class people will say, I'm already paying an exorbitant amount of money for rent, and now a poor person just gets subsidy and living as my neighbor. There's likely to be more discrimination because you're forcing that mixing in an environment where poor people can't adapt in, as opposed to an environment where poor people are accustomed in a comfortable living environment with themselves, and there's a far better comparative in terms of growing revenue by way of a government subsidy. The comparative in our world is, we think we win on the idea of sustainability. Poor people are living in an environment where they not only have better purchasing power in the areas that they're living in, but comfortable living access for their homes. For all this, it's credibly proven that our weighing is more important in this debate. Proud to affirm.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd now like to call on the second speaker of the negative team to continue this debate.
Hi, Just would like to make sure I'm visible and audible. Right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the moment affirmative loses this debate was when they took such a big burden and say, you know what, we will pay for their water bill, we will pay for the electricity bill, we will pay for their rent assessment, we will pay for their land assessment. Note panel, all these costs incurs every month. How long and how many people is government going to continuously keep paying for their water bill, the electricity bill, their rent assessment bill? Imagine every single month you're paying for thousands of them for 12 different months. And now you have multiple projects happening at the same time throughout your project. Third world countries will definitely fail in this model because government is trying to take too much of a big burden and say we can do everything. No, they can't do it. Let's begin with a few responses. Firstly, in terms of discrimination, you know what, my neighbor is getting subsidy. Panel, the moment you classify a project as public housing, that means everyone living within the house has some form of economic damage, some form of lower income range people. That means why is the discrimination going to occur when I know my neighbor is also someone poor? You are not going to find a millionaire living in any public housing projects. The moment you classify public housing, everyone is going to be some form poor, and it is very likely to have discrimination. Secondly, in terms of accountability, panel, I want to highlight to you that state laws and property law exist to make sure corporations ensure all the standards of the project are met. What is the metric here then? In government, it is very unlikely for you to sue the government and win the government because A, state is the one controls the law. B, state has more resources than you as an individual. And C, no government will want to lose a sue since it will damage their reputation, which will end up losing voters. What is the comparison in our world? People can sue corporations, and note how government has a less burden in terms of trying to solve the problems. They have an active incentive to enforce the laws because they want to maintain their reputation as a benevolent actor in solving people's problems. Kuhan says no accountability and government can deflect easily by saying, you know what, we already give you the subsidy, it's all up to you now. Panel, state laws and property laws are nuanced towards protecting these people's right against malicious developers in order to make sure they meet the standard expectations. Therefore, accountability is more likely to be in our world because corporations are better incentivized. I'll prove it to you in this response. They claim that, you see, corporations just want profit, so they may not give the importance to the project. If it is true they want just profit, then they are more likely to be develop better projects. Why? Firstly, they want to continue making more profit. This looks like they want more tenders from the government and try and make more profit in the future. Therefore, they will do their best in currently existing projects by giving better materials, lower pricing to beat other corporation standard to get more future tenders from the government. B, corporations are very likely to screw up because the moment you mess up a government project, the state has the right to strip away your developing license and blacklist you in housing developing projects, even within your own private capacity. This license to develop properties is so important because that is the fundamental basis of their business operation. Since there's an active incentive for these private corporations to maintain their license and continue in the business, they're not likely going to be messing up with the projects. Third response then, benefit is not consistent for community groups in subsidies change. Affirmative tells you, look, the community will sometimes get a lot, sometimes don't get. The metric here is simple, government. In a world where affirmative, the government monopolizes public housing, there is zero net benefit already in terms of community participation. Even if the benefit of subsidy is marginal in negative, giving people the ability to participate, giving community the ability to participate in building their own houses is already a net benefit which affirmative has to concede. Note how community has an active incentive to conduct charity programs, fundraising programs, to develop products. Even in the terms of scale, they were to get few hundred thousands or few $1,000,000. It doesn't matter because in the competition of government is they're getting nothing. No matter how much money they get, any money is good because they can pay for their own maintenance funds. They can pay for their sinking fund. This looks like repainting old or less finished paintings. You know, these kind of things that you can do. Moving on to my positive material. Why government alone as an actor in building house is bad? Firstly, we need to talk about the timeline. It is going to be very late and take a longer time. Why? First, in order for government to pass budgets and develop public housing projects in developed areas, they need to go through parliament, conduct debates, ensure the debate is being passed and approved. Only then they can begin construction for all these things. Secondly, government has to oversee so many projects at the same time to make sure qualities are met individually for each project. And at most times, it is the same inspection team that is being placed. Note that properties cannot be built or begin for sale unless they're given CCC, Certificate of Completion and safety, fitness. So if you want to send the same government official at every single different project, make sure the quality is met, it is going to take such a longer time. What is the comparison in our world? There are a lot of different corporations, community projects, and there are multiple actors involved. It is going to reduce the time frame to achieve this, since there are multiple corporations who are individually working in their own capacity. This looks like people themselves hiring their own inspection officers to make sure the qualities are met. And even if in a world where they don't meet these expectations, government officials are there to enforce and make sure they do this. Not how enforcing is such a better mechanism than you yourself trying to take up the project and doing. Secondly, in terms of sustainable funding, they fail to answer to us how long can government constantly fund all social project housings alone, making it free for people on their own, because you need to pay for the full price. And now affirmative also takes a burden and say, you know what, we will also pay for your maintenance, because in your world people can't meet. In corporations panel, you need to spend a lower amount since you're only subsidizing a parcel cost and not fully paying. If it is true Ahsan wants to claim we now have more money to pay for bill for schools, transport, and hospitals, note how the fund available for welfare is much more higher in our world, because instead of paying 200,000 or 300,000 for the full price of property, we are now subsidizing it and reducing the bracket of people's ability to buy houses in the first place. If every year government is going to pay maintenance and more projects are constantly being built, the budget for the state to continuously fund this welfare is going to be keep increasing. My third thing then, in terms of how people owning asset, I think affirmative was very dismissive in the claim, and Kuhan said things to us like, it doesn't matter within the model, what happens end of the tenancy, I'll prove you. They give us a principle of ownership and management. Panel, the principle is only right when state owns things like buses, state owns things like train, because the utility of the product is being used by millions of people. But the difference when it comes to housing is the private space of kitchen, the private use of bathroom is something individualized and personal. It is not same as buses and train. That is why real estates are assets, but in most instances, people's only form of immovable assets that they own. When you allow government to directly own this, people end up not having any assets under their name throughout their life. Why is this important? When government constantly owns public housing, especially in terms of poor people, the people will never have the ability to own. And secondly, in terms of the response, how long are they going to say? It is very important for you to tell us what happens at the end of the tenancy. Will you kick the person out? Because if you kick the person out, you're putting them or throwing them back into the poverty cycle. But in your world, you're leaving them out without any asset. Will you replace them with other poor people who you find is more needy when someone becomes rich? We need to know what happens at the end of all these instances in order to ensure what is the best, because people owning asset is a much more important principle than government owning those houses. And finally, in terms of maintenance of property, government complain to people hoping government will solve my pipe has burst, my sewage has leaked. Note how government now has a chain of properties owned. It is going to take much more time to repair individually, because they are most likely to have the same maintenance teams for within the region. This looks like if a pipe or sewage system in a bathroom is not working, I might wait for days or even weeks or even months just to make sure government sends it official and check. When it's corporation, when they sell the house, the house comes together with warranty for 5 to 10 years. Therefore, any defect within the building, corporations themselves have to come and fix. The moment you lodge a report and a corporation fails to take action, you can enforce law and try to take action. And government will be the party who enforces the state laws existing. And corporations have an incentive to fix quickly, like I said earlier, the incentive to maintain their reputation and win more tenders. But what is the comparison in their world? When governments don't fix, who are you going to complain to then? Because you already lodged your report, but it's not being fixed. It's affecting your life quality directly. In comparison, corporations have an active incentive to make sure they come and fix. What is the final conclusion of this debate here, panel? I think firstly, in terms of accountability, I have proven to you why corporations are more accountable actor, because they want to maintain their profit incentive and get more tender. But in their world, government is an actor who doesn't want to get sued. Government is an actor who has an active incentive to hide problems, hide things from happening, because they do not want to damage the votes received from people. Secondly, I proved to you in my speech why it is far more easier for you to enforce this law. That is why in this world, government doesn't own every single project. Government doesn't develop everything. They outsource this to corporation, because it is easier for them to enforce these things rather than forcing the people to them do self. Never been prouder to oppose.
Right, thank you for that speech. Just a reminder to stay in time, as our judges and our panel won't be writing anything after 8 minutes and 15 seconds. All right, now I'd like to call on the third speaker of the affirmative team to continue this debate.
Hello, am I visible and audible? Let me just find my doc. Give me a minute. Dave, where the fuck is the doc? Where's your old?
My old docker.
Yeah.
What do you mean, okay?
Your old.
Yesterday's one.
Okay, sorry about that. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. There are two questions I'm going to answer in my speech. The first, which side provides more access to the poor? And the second, which side provides better housing as a whole? On the first question, which side provides more access for the poor? I want to first deal with the call out that team of negative things is like the winning call out this debate. I would argue that our principle still applies because what we're talking about here is a public good, right? Which is obviously allocated based on need. All of this just means that when this is applied to public housing, we ensure that the most amount of people are able to access housing at the best rate possible. That means all of their call outs about how the government still kind of manages this on their side of the house, or why it doesn't really, or why this only applies to public housing, it doesn't really carry any weight in this debate because all our arguments have been nuanced to particularly why public housing is one that is a public good that the government itself has the mandate to manage. The second part, or like what I'm going to do within this question, is at least prove to you why we get better access, better funding in terms of how people are able to access this good in the first place, and I'll weigh out all their harms of like time, etc., bureaucratic problems that the government faces. In terms of funding, right? Our like mech in which we get funding is very simple. Government money through taxes, reserves, budgets, etc. Their response is just, I don't know how, a few responses to this. The first, this is symmetrical, so I don't know how your corporations or NGOs and communities are going to specifically fund all this, given that they cannot inherently prove as to why their budget is going to be much larger than the government. But also secondly, the beauty of the government funding anything is that they're able to fund at a loss, and they're able to do this at a continuous level, right? All of this just means that we can continuously fund things at a loss. This is what we do for education, this is what we do for healthcare. So in that instance, I don't know why this concern about how your expenses are going to incur monthly is one that is immaterial to any government, given that they are able to do this, and given that we are debating in a world in which governments have the capacity to do this. But let's look at the incentive then. I just want to weigh out public good versus public ownership over a public good. Negative argues that you can't really apply this principle because compared to like trains and buses, it's used by millions of people. Note that if they want their best case to materialize, obviously a few millions of people would have to access this housing in the first place. So the principle then applies there. But just as a general principle, right? If your good is one to be used for or without profit, I'll argue that the best actor to manage this is the government, given that we've given you reasons as to why a government is more accountable, a government has more data to complement their decision making, a government is able to integrate their systems to complement the housing, i.e. developing more areas or purposely subsidizing housing in lesser developed areas for the whole purpose of ensuring that your living costs are much cheaper. But let's look at accountability then. Notice that every accountability mechanism on team negative, i.e. your company wants more people to get units, is based on the idea that they want more tenants, right? But notice the nature of public goods. Public goods will always have an inelastic demand, or I don't remember what the proper economics term is, but basically your demand or your supply doesn't really require demand, right? Because note that as long as you have that KPI, as long as it seems like community centers are doing anything, that is when in which people feel like, or at least the accountability model kind of stops there, right? But negative then contends, or at least asserts, that corporations won't mess this up. But I'd argue that corporations messing up is inherent to their business model, right? Corporations always have a natural incentive to inflate the price or the value of their units, which means that obviously your poor people have to either find more money to, or your communities have to find more money to subsidize this housing, or secondly, your poor people have to foot these costs, right? But so secondly, then a lot of their harms be symmetrical then, right? Because if their end all is that the government will hold these corporations or community centers accountable, everything that they talked about that happens on the outside is symmetrical. Why is this harmful then? Given that the government doesn't have a direct hand in this. I would argue that holding corporations accountable or like holding community centers is much more accountable because firstly, there's very little precedence for holding community centers accountable. But this is secondly, holding corporations accountable is so much more worse. If the government were to sue a corporation, they have to bypass laws like piercing the corporate veil, which is a law that is specified to protect corporations from the exact same thing negative teams assumes will happen on their side of the house. So what are the metrics then, and why do we think our side wins out? On the first metric, on at least vulnerability, we at least ensure that a larger number of people are able to access this housing, given that governments have a much larger budget or much larger capacity to fund the most number of houses. The second is on scale, right? We argue to why a larger number of people are able to maintain this housing, given that we are able to hold governments accountable. Governments have a unique incentive in which they need to ensure that they continue to remain in power, even if it is not your federal government, it's your state governments as well. There's so many elections that require the government, that the government needs to win to hold power. I'd argue then that is a unique inherent incentive that we have in our side of the house. Let's look at the other harms that Team Negative talks about, things like time, bureaucratic processes, etc. I'd argue that all this is inconsequential to at least the largest number of people being able to access housing, because if it is time that they're concerned about, I'd argue that time is somewhat symmetrical. It takes a large amount of time to build that house. But secondly, in terms of bureaucratic processes, I'd argue in that instance, if the concern of bureaucratic processes is that it isn't high on the government's priority, I'd argue that housing is not that high on like the priority of corporations and NGOs as well, given that they have probably a lesser budget or at least a lesser allocation of money towards housing. And secondly, that they have no precedence in this, that they don't already have housing, so they have to start everything from the ground up. All of this just means that a lesser number of people are able to access the good that Team Negative talks about. Second part of my speech, which side provides better quality housing? Negative contends that the quality of our housing would be bad, but argue that all of this is inconsequential if we at least provide to you that the base level of security is secured, i.e. assessments of the safety of the housing, etc. It doesn't really matter if contractors work with private like contractors or not, because at the end of the day, people still opt in our house. It's not like we're lowballing these contractors, given that a lot of contractors actively pursue government contracts in the first place. They want government contracts because there's a lot of money involved in them. It is a job opportunity. Don't buy any negative assertions that people wouldn't really want to opt to this contract in the first place. I'd also argue that in the world of negative, you'd need to cater to community housing and public housing the most, which presumably takes away from being able to benefit those that could benefit from subsidies that other community centers can provide, like direct access to food, like direct involvement in the community, i.e. soup kitchens, shelters, etc. These are the things that you take away from community centers. And if we're talking about NGOs as well, the same thing applies, which is why we'd argue why corporations are most likely to be the ones that are directly involved in housing the most on-site negative, and why we'd argue to that is a terrible thing to do. So let's look at the weighing here. Enforcing the government enforcing it versus the government managing everything. I'd argue that when the government manages everything, they're able to integrate whatever information that they have, i.e. data, etc., to ensure that the most needy are the ones that are getting this housing in the first place, and also to ensure that the quality of their life is somewhat maintained as well. I'll argue secondly that the government's ability to integrate systems just means that the government is more likely to develop things around the housing, like kindergartens for your kids or schools for your grown-up kids. All of this just means that the government's ability for you to now assess your quality of life is much more higher as compared to a corporation that is likely to do things like hide information. If negative wants to contend that hiding information is one that a government is likely to do, I'd argue that's difficult because apparently your bureaucracy is one that hurts the government. So this requires more bureaucracy. So that argument just doesn't really stand. But this is secondly, I'd argue that corporations have more of an incentive and precedence to do this. If corporations need to, as what negative team says, ensure that more people buy into their housing, I'd argue that there's more incentive for you to silence the poor when they raise concerns about housing, etc. Let's look at their end goal. Apparently it's people owning houses. I don't know why this is at least somewhat attainable at the side of negative. I really don't hear much explanation as to why this is attainable, but compared to our end goal, at least the quality of life of a poor person is one that's protected to the largest extent. Extremely proud to affirm.
Okay, thank you for that speech. And now to call on the third speaker of the negative team to conclude the substantive portion of this debate.
Hi, am I visible and audible? All right.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to prepare my speech.
Go for it. I'm just walking straight away. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I don't think this is opera where side affirmative can get away just by explaining that side government has a fiat, so we can give everyone houses without explaining where they're going to get these funds from, right? Side affirmative at least has a burden to at least explain the simple basic link on where you're getting this money from. And I can just solve this in one sentence. Obviously, taxpayers' money, and exclusively they haven't proved why this is a good trade-off, or they haven't proved why the benefits weigh out taxpayers' money, or it's been beneficial enough for taxpayers' money to be used in a beneficial way. 3 things I'll be doing in my speech today. Firstly, few technical flaws from side affirmative. Secondly, a comparative on significant issues in today's debate, bring why side negative takes today's debate. And thirdly, a summary of negative's case. Few technical flaws from side affirmative. Firstly, panel, I don't think Ahsan, first speaker of affirmative, can get away with saying that you know what is in our world? Corporations would own houses. Outsourcing houses to corporations happen all the time in status quo in various countries. And in all of these countries, people own the houses, not corporations. So side affirmative can't be super uncharitable in saying that corporations will own the houses on our side. Secondly, understand that there was no characterization at all coming from side affirmative on the technicalities on these public houses. They say that, oh, we don't really need to provide characterization. Then how do we get to decide who stays and how long? What is the significance then of your whole argument on that data sharing if you're not going to explain towards us how you're going to ensure that these individuals stay in that houses for what period of time, or how much money you're going to fork into these individual houses when these individuals are just going to stay inside these houses forever, since they don't give us a time frame on how long these individuals are staying there. Thirdly, understand that our model is not strictly towards corporations or organizations only, right? We think that states outsource these projects to corporations would make these things even better, because eventually the government is also involved comparatively on our side. So data sharing and stuff that side affirmative has, the problems that side affirmative has on side negative, are things that are mutually exclusive on our side, because we can also have data sharing on our side. Government is also probably involved in things like who is staying in these houses, how long these individuals are staying in these houses, and generally involvement in the project. It's just that we are outsourcing these projects towards corporations and the community as a whole. Fourthly, understand that Kuhan came to us and said that, panel, this debate is a value judgment debate. Panel, this debate is not a value judgment debate. This debate should be on which side is more effective in executing public houses, whether A, side affirmative through only involvement of governments, and B, side negative through various stakeholders getting involved. That should be the debate. This is not a value judgment debate. Do not let Kuhan get away with this. Fifthly, their whole argument on uniformity, I have no idea what that is. I don't understand why must houses be uniform. I have no idea why the roofs of houses must look similar for individuals to stay in it. I don't see any beneficial interest in that. That argument is just a wash. Moving on towards my first issue. Is it true now that corporations are a bad actor to include? Firstly, panel, I'm tired of hearing this argument on corporations are always bad because they care about money. You know what? Everyone loves money, yet not everyone is evil, right? Note that panel, projects by the governments, such as giving out food stamps, welfare, and private hospitals, are all done by states with negotiations with corporations. So if you're going to argue that corporations are bad in the first place, all of your other welfare projects, all projects basically the government do, all big projects are funded and negotiated with corporations. So you can't really say that corporations are just evil actors and they are no good corporations, right? It's not true that all corporations are evil, right? Many real estate companies are also not public, so that's something you should acknowledge. So there's always an incentive for these corporations to be good. What are they? Firstly, understand that our model already reduces risks, which is a big thing in housing. We already give them the land that we need. We are already the best creditors when it comes to any types of creditors, because we're the government. So at least on our side, corporations have an incentive because they get a big deal and they're getting a lot of profit from these deals. Secondly, understand that if these corporations do shit, or if these corporations do bad things and also involved but not directly owning these houses, just find other corporations, right? The good thing about our case on side negative is understand there's a lot of corporations, and since we already clearly told you, we can tell you that a lot of corporations would be interested in our projects. Therefore, with a variety of corporations to choose from, therefore the choices are unlimited on our side comparatively towards your side, right? Affirmative at least have to be charitable and engage in our arguments and not just argue that corporations are evil, right? Secondly, even if you wanted to believe that corporations are evil, are governments then the best actor? Not once did side affirmative wanted to deal with this. If you can argue that corporations are evil because there are some capitalistic corporations, I can flip it and say the same, that government governments are not also always the best actors when they are corrupted and have different ideologies. The delta of this issue here, at least a government is much more harder to deal when it comes to its accountability, because no one can probably sue the government, or no one can probably complain the government, or the government has a lot of influence when it comes to their power in a country. So you can't really do anything towards a particular government. Comparatively towards corporations, it's much more easier to deal with, and government also have so much more other considerations to deal with, right? For an example, government has loans, government has healthcare to think about. At least when we give things towards corporations that specifically deals with building houses, their only job is building houses. Explain to me, why is that in the incentive of the corporations, incentive of the government? Even if the government has an incentive, why is the government capable of handling full power towards like public housing and also focusing on other things such as welfare and things that they need to take care of, right? Public housing in itself, understand, is a socialist ideology. So if there's a government that's a capitalist or a conservative, probably wouldn't even exist public housing in your first place, right? So corporations are always profit incentivized. At least that's a constant, no matter what kind of government you have. So we'll always argue that corporations have has an incentive to at least ensure that public housing is done properly and maintained properly. Thirdly, affirmative said that their goal is to be fighting for the poor, right? But never once did they give us an example of poorer countries where the issues of individuals not having houses is significantly larger in these countries, right? They want to talk about big countries, the United States, Australia, all these Western countries, right? But understand that why they chose to do that is because a lot of times when you think about it, their model wouldn't work in these countries. Like I have already stated towards you, since maintaining itself is going to take a longer cost, and since there's no proper duration when it comes towards these individuals staying in these houses, we would argue towards you that you need a large amount of money comparatively for the government to directly manage to build, to have all these raw materials comparatively to our side, right, where the corporations are involved. Hence, you probably would need more taxpayers' money comparatively on your side. So that's the delta here, that's the burden that you have to take, and they haven't explained to us how is this money being used in a purposeful way, and why is it principally okay to do this, right? Fourthly, affirmative comes up and said, you know what, governments also have an incentive to do all this, to fix the houses and stuff. Why would government hide and unlikely to maintain houses? Two things. Firstly, government has a lot of things to do, healthcare, other types of sectors to take care of. So even probably if they have the incentives to take care of public housing, or if they wanted to make public housing better, they still have other sectors to worry about. So it's very hard to expect the government to fix anything. Secondly, understand that corporations will fix this because they want the money, right? They want because that's the only job, that's the only source of income. So we think that corporations have a high likelihood of actually being more successful. So the weighing here is simple. Even in their best case, they eventually will use more taxpayers' money. At least in our side, we have houses. We just don't have taxpayers' money as much, and comparatively, corporations can maintain these houses. Second issue, short issue. Which world is access better? We argue that in affirmative, since governments are handling it directly, it would definitely take time, right? Note that in your side, you have to probably go through parliament. You have to agree on the money is released. You have to agree on probably a budget before releasing the budget, and that's only when you can probably go through this public housing, right? So time is not really symmetrical, Catherine. On our side, it's much more better because we give this corporation's job to do this, so it's much more faster and much more exclusive. Why is our access better? Firstly, we build more houses in shorter period of time, and secondly, zero barrier entry either way is not a solution, because we don't think it's a smart move to just give everyone houses in a short period of time, because eventually it's not sustainable. We want something that's sustainable, where the only side that understand how housing works with the benefits of corporations and communities go with side negative.
All right, thank you very much for that speech. And now to call on the neg reply.
I just like to make sure I'm visible and audible. Setting my timer. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. End of the day, the biggest clash of this debate was whether it is much more important to give access to people, and also whether it's much more important to ensure a sustainable model for government to continuously give access to all these poor people in the longer run. How do we win this debate? Firstly, in terms of technical fault coming from side affirmative, they have been extremely convenient in framing all the arguments. They claim that we will pay their water bill, their electricity bill, their maintenance fund. Heck, what? You just waive their property tax also, which is one of the biggest source of government's income. What are the responses to these two? First, A, it is the likelihood of government to continuously fund this project at loss. If you continue to do that, at a point where you reach a breaking point, either A, your budget will burst, or B, you will just stop funding the fund as well. The moment you stop funding the people because you have other important issues to address, like pandemic or educational issues, you throw these people into shock. They're already poor because all this while when government is paying, suddenly now the government can't be paying because maybe the taxpayers say, oh, why are you paying my money to the people? And government changes. The impact is when the bubble bursts, people are thrown back into poverty, they are homeless again. At least in our world, even if the government stops paying electricity bill, people still own their house, which is an immovable asset and is very important to them. B, when government pays for all these costs, knows how people are likely to react. They're going to waste water, they're going to waste electricity because you have no incentive to save money at all, because incentive only exists when I pay for myself. I want to save money. When it becomes free, people are going to waste all these resources, so it's unlimited for them and government are paying to them. Second question then, who is more accountable? Affirmative tells us, you know what, government can give subsidy and deflect blame to corporations. Panel, firstly, we have proven to you why corporations are less likely to screw up because they want to maintain their business license. They don't want to get it stripped away by states. But B, if government is the one who chooses, elects, and awards the corporation the tender to develop the project, therefore, the government will never be able to deflect blame because people can still not call out the government. Why did you choose such a terrible corporation to manage my public housing? Because they're doing it such a bad, terrible. Therefore, at all instances, government is still going to be accountable. But the second question is then, who is the one who enforces and makes sure people are really accountable? They tell to us, you know what, government have a unique incentive to remain in power. They will fix everything. They won't make it a problem. Panel, government has a better incentive in hiding the problems themselves because they want to maintain the reputation and not getting sued. But let's assume and be charitable, even if they're benevolent and they fix everything. Note that fixing is going to take much more longer because government has so many housing projects that use solely and individually old. It is going to take much more time for you to do it. What is the comparison then? If corporations choose not to fix, people can go to the government and government will take the necessary actions and force corporations to fix using laws or the basis of avoiding next corporation. But in their world, when government is the one who screws up, who doesn't fix my sewage system, the people there are left without any answerable properties. And note, when it's small scale and singular project, these people are already poor, they have no resource, they're not strong enough to call out to government actions. It is very easy for government to just shut down all their voices. In comparison, these people can lodge report to government where government will then enforce and make sure people, corporations do make changes. What in this affirmative say as a whole? They tell to us, you know what, we help poor people get housing, we make their life comfortable, forgive everything. In our world, we told you, even if you do this, why it is not sustainable? Firstly, you will never ever be able to fiat and say we will continuously fund for everything. There is no singular existing model where the government pays for water bill, electricity bill, pay their property taxes, pay for their land assessment, rent assessment. It is just not a world which you are able to sustain. But B, even if government were to give public utilities for fee, note how they still charge small amount. Bus, trains, you still have to pay for these utilities. That is what gives people the incentive to actually maintain those things or have good responsible over taking care of those things. The reason why we question who is going to own next, because if I'm going to simply own in a house and I damage the property and I leave the property up for the next person, government has to rake in more money, try to fix all these things. End of the debate panel, it is clear. If you want to help the most people in terms of scale for a longer and sustainable term, you choose house negative. Because if they were to claim that, you know, public housing is a solution for all homeless people, I don't think it's true. Homeless people will always continue to exist. A unburstable bubble which is sustainable for long term is a choice moving forward. Never been further to oppose.
Okay, thank you very much for that speech. And now to call on the affirmative reply speaker to conclude this debate.
Hello. Can you guys see and hear me? All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. This debate was an absolute bore. Like, come on, guys. I thought it'd be more interesting, right? Like, we're going the best institution in Malaysia is having their two best teams face each other. I expect more like maturity in terms of arguments and more depth. But jokes aside, let's get into it, right? Number one, 2 technical flaws in terms of side negative. Firstly, they don't nuance it to different actors. Understand we're not just dealing with NGOs and community groups, but also private corporations. In their world, they only dealt with private corporations. This is bad to their case, especially because we ran a lot of nuances about NGOs and community groups that went unresponded to. They are an unresponsive side. But secondly, in terms of the model, there's a slight shift in the case of negative, because on one hand, they say corporations own these houses, but then suddenly in their world, like corporations don't necessarily own these houses, but then it's just outsourcing it to a different entity, but it's actually owned by the government. Like if the government actually owns this project and it's a public public housing project, what's the logic of it outsourcing to a different entity for them to subsidize, right? But also, Rashrvin says convenience, and he argues about like private corporations continuously maintaining. I would argue that's a direct contradiction towards the model that's posited towards them, that private corporations don't own this to begin with. But onto four main clashes in the debate and why we win on each one. Firstly, on accountability, they talk about transactional relationships and why laws can hold them accountable and why governments can just strip away these licenses. Number one, governments are unlikely to do this because of how people will perceive them as taking away an important good away from the people. But also secondly, stripping away of licenses will only happen when there's a big mess up, not because like access isn't enough or not because facilities aren't good. So people can still make reports even if that is true. But I would argue that there's no outcome to those reports. There's no meaningful recourse for individuals on the ground. But secondly, corporations can just take you to court and hire the best fucking legal team in the world to beat you in court, right? I don't think necessarily people who are dependent on public housing will have the funds that are necessary in order to win over corporations in court. It's more concrete on our side. Secondly, they say corporations care about their reputation. What reputation? Since when? It's not corporation. It's not corporate reputation that corporations care about. It's profit, especially when that profit can insulate their reputation from being hurt by hiring better legal teams, better marketing teams in terms of making them seem like an actor that's actually good. But the comparative then is that on government, on our side, why it's much better in terms of government. Rashrvin says there's bureaucratic barriers and it'll take a long time, and we need to debate it. Government have many things to care about. I think it's good that we can debate out these policies for its best implementation, right? I think it's good that we can have politicians in parliament that can call out these issues and talk about why it's important that we have a policy that is meaningful. On your side, you don't have this accountability. Corporations will talk about in the board meeting of the directors, rich, influential people, why we should just give less to poor people. At the end of the day, we'll still look like the good people. That's the reality on your side. In our world, it's much more concrete. We can vote them out. We can call them out. It's a much higher impact on our side. Second issue then on resources. The negative says we don't have land. We have less resources, less funds. So everything is probably going to suck. Number one, we told you government's probably overseeing a bigger fund for their housing projects, which are likely to be larger scale in our world. This incentivizes governments to be more responsible in terms of policy making and handling budgets. Also, governments will try much harder to source funds, and this increases benefits for other forms of policy as well. The principal push coming from their side is incorporated within this as well, because they said that there are other policies that governments need to care about. I think we prove firstly why the ownership has to be one that's exclusive and there's no comeback to this. But then also we win on this because states are likely to have policies like progressive taxation systems that tax top income brackets higher, therefore increasing our ability to manage other policies as well. So now that we benefit from housing, we can also benefit from things like healthcare and things like that. Even if that is true, they don't prove why the extent of benefit is the same. Because even if the funds are more on the side of negative, what is the incentive for these actors to provide the benefit to the same extent? We prove the incentive why there's an inherent nature for states that pertain to welfare. We prove the pragmatic, even if you have the money on your side, you don't have the comprehensive data. I don't think data sharing is going to be as comprehensive as they say. But thirdly, we prove a deficit, why governments can operate at a loss. They are more likely to take loans. There is no incentive for a private actor like a corporation or an NGO to take a loan in order to fund their housing projects. Also inconsistency, because uniformity is important, Melveer, because of the consistency of benefit, not because of the consistency of these houses. Thirdly, in terms of sustainability, they don't prove why these policies are likely to be sustainable, because the vision of corporations are unlikely to be one that's comprehensive. When they take on a housing project, it isn't just the shelter of these individuals, it's employment, so governments are more likely to build roads, etc. But lastly, Judge, we hammer it home because we talk about the quality of life of poor people. NEC just talks about why this will be cheaper or more expensive. They didn't talk about after getting this home. We talked about purchasing power, why public houses by the government will often be in poorer areas where people can actually afford things. The world in opposition, a world in affirmative is going to look like it being incorporated in wealthy areas, especially when they don't dislodge the claim that corporations will be profit incentivized. We talked about social mixing as well, how the general perception towards poor people is one that is negative. There's a difference in culture, because when a poor person moving in isn't just lowering the value at which I resell my house, but also making more rent more expensive for me, I'm more likely to view poor people or view people who access these forms of housing with disgust. It's much better if governments handle it. Affirmative taken.
Right. Thank you all for that debate, and congratulations on breaking it this far. Feel free to, I think, head back to the main room and our judges will all deliberate.